Before I start, I thought about the topic. Thought I'd give you a little bit background about who we are. It's Pitney Bowes. Probably most of you know us as from the left-hand side of this slide as the guys who, 100-year-old company almost with a franking machine. Since then, though, we've really expanded into a lot of different areas, and in particular, we've been about in the global e-commerce, which is the topic I'm going to talk about today, since 2009. And what that means is we do both in terms of domestic shipping, but also a big part of our work is really cross-border. We service about 220 customers worldwide in different markets, and with about 300 plus storefronts and ship and also localize the website, etc. So that's sort of the context of what it is I'm going to speak about today. We normally do, and we've been doing this for years, run an annual study, a shopper study on cross-border. And we did that again this year with 12,000 consumers in 12 markets, 11 countries, but also Hong Kong as a territory. What we did this year that is a little bit different, though, is what we hadn't done in the past. We also talked to retailers. So the numbers you see here, we talked about a little bit over 1,200 retailers in 8 countries and 12,000 consumers. And I'll get to a little bit later on why we did that. But in essence, if you look at all the different studies, and I'm sure we've all seen a large number of them, they've normally focused on either the domestic side of online commerce or on the cross-border side of commerce. In addition, though, they've either looked at what consumers are doing or what retailers are doing themselves. As you'll see later on, there's certain dynamics, and this is what we wanted to get to. We wanted to see a more broader spectrum of what's happening in the retail space, both domestically, but also how that's actually impacting, or how that is working together with cross-border in terms of preferences on the consumer side. But also we wanted to juxtapose that in terms of what are retailers planning on doing, what are some of the things they're actually doing both domestically and in cross-border, and seeing if there's a disparity between those two. And we find a couple of tidbits. Some of the things you're going to see you're probably already familiar with, being retailers yourself, but there's a little bit of surprises in here. And there's certain dynamics, as you'll see, in particular on the domestic side. E-commerce is growing, but that sort of growth is peaking slightly. Whereas on the cross-border side, we see it in the ascendancy. There's a lot of retailers that are planning or already are doing cross-border, but it's growing much faster than the domestic side of things. And you're also going to see some differences in terms of what the priorities are for retailers in both these markets, both domestic and global e-commerce, and actually what consumers' priorities are. So if we start off, ultimately, what we wanted to get to is to really just answer one fundamental question. How can retailers grow? And there's a lot of data that came out of this research, as you can imagine. This presentation itself focuses on answering this question, and we're only highlighting some of the key things and takeaways that we find from the data that I think you're going to find of interest. So what we found is there are 3 key levers. As I mentioned earlier, the first one here is on the domestic side. What we're seeing there is that competition in the online space, to some of you that might be very obvious, it's really heated up. The retail market, especially in the Western market, less so in the Asian market, but they're sort of coming up pretty fast, is really heating up. And a key areas of differentiation there is more about operational excellence, and in particular in certain areas that we know marketplaces, I know Alexander talked a little bit about marketplaces earlier, that they are really, really good at. And there's certain things we can take away from what they're doing well and transfer it over to us as retailers. The second lever is what we're talking about as near-border markets. When we talk to the retailers, a lot of us sort of talk about cross-border. What we actually mean is more near-border. And we differentiated that from the farther away what we call truly global cross-border markets. And I'll share with you why we're making that distinction, because there are different dynamics between those two. So honing in on the first area here, which is the number one, focusing on the domestic markets. What we saw is that from the research that we've done, and this is just between last year and this year, is the frequency with which consumers are buying online is growing, but it's not growing as fast as it used to. Now, and it varies across different markets, but if you look at this chart, where it's really growing fast, is still growing fast, is in Canada and Australia, and the remainder of the markets in Western Europe, and a little bit in Mexico and some of the emerging markets. But in other markets, in particular, for the UK, for example, the frequency has gone down by about 2%. That probably is more of a cyclical decline. The main point of this chart is that we're not, although domestic e-commerce is growing, it's starting to hit a peak. And that's on average 2% year on year between 2016 and 2017. If we then talk to retailers and ask sort of the same question or similar question from their perspective, and on the left side you'll see that data is for the UK, which was surprising to us, but over 60% of retailers in the UK are seeing either 10% growth or actually negative growth in the global e-commerce side. And that, again, is a little bit related to what I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of competition. It's no longer, the pie is no longer increasing on the e-commerce side. It's coming from different players and changing, in particular around the retail. I'm not talking about the new models and Uber and the likes, but in particular around retail, global e-commerce, domestic e-commerce is not increasing that much. It's in the single digit, and for some retailers in the UK, it's actually declining. We then asked the question that you see on the right on the slide here, what are your plans in the next year? In particular, where are your investment going to go? And we have, if you look at the slide for the UK, there was a real strong over-indexing on, we're going to focus on direct commerce relative to the global average, but even to some of the countries, other countries we talked to in Europe, in particular France and Germany, they've spread it evenly between marketplaces, brick and mortar stores. But in the UK, there is, think about it as that sort of doubling down on the direct commerce side of things. And sort of digging deeper underneath that, it makes a little sense. It's sort of reflecting of a little bit of risk averseness, in the sense that when you go into marketplaces, you are given a certain level of control. And there's a strategic risk in the long term that you might not be able to, a couple of things. One, control the brand experience for the customer. Two, you might have the margin pressures because of the fact that you're now allowing some of the dynamics that are happening in the marketplace to drive how you run your business. And at the end of the day, if you think of marketplace, it's really a rented property. You are more or less renting a property from someone else, and in that sense, there's a loss of control that you're giving over to the marketplaces. But that was really interesting. And when we talked to them about, compared that to the consumer side, and if you look on the left, there is a disparity between what consumers are planning to do in terms of growth of where they buy from versus what, this is another chart on the right-hand side that also talks a little bit, it's not just the UK, it's all other countries. But if you look at the consumer side of things, overwhelming majority prefer to shop in marketplaces. Not that they don't like or don't prefer to shop in direct, but this is an average, of course. It's across categories and across different customer groups. But on average, there's a strong preference for marketplaces. And it's pretty profound even in the UK. It's not just in the emerging markets where marketplaces are really big in terms of share of the e-commerce space. And then contrast that with what the retailers are planning to do. And again, they're focused on the direct commerce side of things and not so much on either increasing demand or sell on marketplaces. We then sort of dug in a little deeper and asked, so in particular, when you think about what investment are you going to make on the direct commerce side of things, the UK over-indexed relative to other countries in particular, both in Europe but also across Asia and North America, is a place around more in the customer delivery experience. So if you look at this chart, if you look at the top one, they're more related to the delivery experience for the consumer. So they're not focusing as much on, if you look at the bottom ones, a lot of them are focused on margin improvement and profitability. It's more around how can I improve the consumer experience. It's sort of putting all the stuff together, the couple of slides before. Again, some of the key preferences that we're seeing consumers veering towards, they are driven by some key players that Alexander, I don't know where he is, was hoping no one would be representative of here. But their preferences are increasingly being driven by, in certain particular areas, especially around the experience delivery side of things, by the best in class, and how they experience that, they want to have the same experience even from brands direct or other retailers. And that sort of jives together with, Alexander touched on this a little bit as well early on, it sort of works together with the preferences that consumers have expressed. So if you look at this chart, people were given a trade-off. Would you prefer free shipping but lower delivery time versus having to pay for it at a cost but a shorter delivery time? And that could, of course, be either collect in store or deliver to home, etc. So we do see a little bit confluence here between what retailers are planning to do in terms of investment over next year. A lot of it has to do with the customer delivery experience, less so with profitability. Similarly, on the consumer side, they want to have to pay less to get it delivered rather than have it tomorrow or today. The other thing that came out of this study that was really surprising for us is, and again, Alexander touched on this, is a large percentage of consumers either don't know or are not happy with the return process. So one way of reducing people returning is not providing a good service, but in essence, we do know from there's some data behind this that it is a key part of what customers are requiring of retailers to deliver for them to buy from. So the key takeaway here is that low-cost shipping is both a conversion and it can be a profit driver, either by improving the logistics or, quite frankly, asking for lower rates if you have the volumes. But in particular, from consumers' perspective, they do want to see that dropping. In particular, free is more important than fast shipping. So in terms of which carriers that you offer and that you work with is really critical. Having just one option where it's just fast delivery at cost is not sufficient. You may want to offer some other options where it's really low cost and it may take a longer time. And quite frankly, we're starting to see that same dynamic, including an international cross-border, and we'll come back to that later on. And finally, end-to-end management of the logistics, including the inbound logistics, is critical in terms of improving the experience the customers have when it is for the returns that they send. If you look at all these three things, it is essentially what marketplaces have identified as a necessity for them to succeed. And those who are succeeding are delivering on all these three. Because ultimately, what they're looking to do is to offer the broadest product segment possible, deliver it at the lowest cost possible and as quickly as is possible within profit. Hence, the cue in the domestic market is more on the operational side and to improve on, to match what customers are now expecting from retailers online. If we now shift gear to the second lever that we discussed, if you talk to retailers, as I mentioned earlier, when you talk about cross-border, what they really think about is more near-border. And I'll show a slide later on why we're calling it near-border, because in essence, what's happening is most retailers are now either actually about 75, over 90% are selling cross-border, but the majority of those 90% are focusing on near border. When we mean by near border, it could be geographic, it could be on the language side or cultural. And I'm going to spend some time going through that. So here's on the retail side of things, and if you look at the global, like I mentioned, we asked who is currently doing cross-border and who's planning to within the next 12 months. The response was only 7% are not currently doing it or not planning to do it within the next 12 months. And that's more or less consistent across all markets we talk to. In particular, if you look at the UK and France and Germany, there's not a lot of differences there. We then ask consumers who, if they're planning to buy cross-border, if they're already buying cross-border. And if you see this chart, it's very similar to the one we asked about the domestic side of things. The frequency with which consumers are buying cross-border, meaning from companies abroad and having it shipped, it's actually growing faster, especially in certain markets. If you look at the UK, it's about a 5% increase in terms of frequency of purchase relative to last year. But if you look at some of the more far-off countries such as India and China and Mexico, and in particular Canada as well, they're actually growing really fast. So there's a great opportunity on the cross-border side as you continue to solidify and compete in the domestic space. Here's where it gets really interesting. So we ask retailers, why are you actually selling cross-border or planning to sell cross-border? And then we ask consumers, why would you want to buy from companies that are selling to have it shipped internally? And we looked at different dimensions, and you see 4 of them here that we found really interesting and are key. The one that really caught us by surprise is if you look at the top in the blue, on the retail side, the top one is because of the competition in the domestic marketplace and related to how they perceive their brand is considered in foreign markets, they're looking at it as more of a predominantly 56% as a means of tapping into profitable markets. Interesting enough, you talk to the consumer side, and they're actually one of the key reasons, the top reason, is because of price. They're looking for a lower price. Now, bear in mind, this is average across all markets, a lot of categories, so you're going to see variances. In particular, in Asia, China, India, they will be ready to offer, pay a price premium. But on average, there's a big dissonance between what retailers are thinking, why they need to go cross-border, and why consumers in those markets are looking to buy. So in this case, by the way, on the left-hand side, it's only UK retailers. On the right-hand side, it's all markets we talk to with the exception of UK data. So there's a big dissonance between, in particular, around price and profitability. The second big difference here is that UK retailers perceive, one of the reasons they're going to foreign markets is they want to capitalize on the global brand. Looking on the consumer side of things, again, with the exception of Asia, it's really not a big driver. Brand names plays a part, but it's not the key part. Again, it's on the price, where there's, and it matches directly with the whole price of things. And it sort of makes sense if you think about how a lot of retailers have gone about defining where they're going cross-border. They're going to near markets. You have UK retailers going into European markets. Well, they're competing with a couple of other brands. In particular, they're competing with domestic brands for the same type of products, but also almost all other retailers are going cross-border. They're also going into those markets. So the competition on the near border side of things is really taking off, both in terms of competing with the domestic side, but also with other UK retailers who are going into those markets. And we see those 2 dimensions sort of at play, but it has to be addressed. And often when we talk to clients that are thinking about going cross-border, one of the first things they want to do is, can we increase prices because we want to improve our margins? That's a play you can actually go ahead and do, but it's not a very long-term play. It'll really quickly not fizzle out, but ultimately, the consumers in those markets, they're not going to pay such a premium relative to what they can get elsewhere. The areas where there is a confluence between the two is on the leverage value proposition on the retailer side, and consumers are looking for product quality. This is where they might not be able to find the same type of product at the same level of quality. And of course, the last one here is more about a lot of retailers are looking to go cross-border because they want to get there before the competition. And conversely, so on the consumer side, consumers are looking for products that they can get there. All different things in play here. Obviously, these are average data, and there are different dynamics going on in different markets around the world. But these apply predominantly to the near-border space. And that's why we've heard a lot of UK retailers, quite frankly, that went into Europe that are now pulling back because some of these dynamics played out when they put feet on the ground over there. So I mentioned near border here. This is it looks a little bit like confusing, but think about it. Anything that's any of those lines, if you look at top thing here is a lot of the focus in terms of cross-border is going either to the US, UK, Canada, and of course France and Germany. Anything that's going, is sort of going away from the center here is near border. The exception here being Japan, and that has more to do with electronics and some product that they're sending. So this is why we came to the conclusion more around cross-border being more near border in the mind of retailers. There's still an opportunity, but there's certain dynamics that are very similar to the domestic marketplace, and so those dynamics competitive dynamics between domestic and near border, that conversion real fast. Conversely, a lot of the markets that retailers are going into that near border, those retailers are also coming into our market. The other thing that may impact why retailers think of cross-border as being profitable is when we looked at the average order value, it tends to be higher than domestic. In particular for the near-border side of things, because if you think of near-border, it's easier to ship there, it's a lower cost to ship there, or it might be part of a duty-free zone or a trade-free zone, etc. What was interesting for us to see here is that UK retailer actually indexed below the average that we saw for all retailers globally. The area we also saw that retailers are looking to do over the next 12 months is to really push heavily into demand generation. 80% plan to grow cross-border marketing spend over the next 12 months. To drive traffic and start building. But again, the caveat there is if you're doing it, so is everyone else is going into that cross-border. So key takeaways from this is when we talk about cross-border in terms of near-border, consumers don't place as much preference or high premium on brand because quite frankly, domestic products, alternatives are already there, and there are other retailers from our own markets going into those markets. Price is still important, or value for money is key. Having said that, in some market in Asia, that is still the case. There is still that opportunity, but as you can imagine, as more people go into that, we'll see that happening there as well. The second one, key one, is similar to the domestic market, operational execution around minimizing shipment costs and just logistics and everything on the customer delivery experience is equally important. Moving over to what we really call the long cross-border, and this is where we're talking about the more far-off markets. This is where it really pays off to be a Western brand. There's a big differentials because those products may not already be available in that market, but there's also cachet to buying foreign brands. Having said that, though, there's still some localization requirements that retailers need to do in terms of localizing the experience, or whether it's the catalog that you're selling, payment methodologies, etc. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. This is a little bit confusing chart, but what we did is we wanted to identify, over the next month, we asked 2 questions, again, from retailers and consumers. On the retail side, we asked them, what are your top 3 markets that you're going to be targeting over the next, critical for cross-border over the next 12 months? And we then, in this case, for France, you'll see France, UK, and Germany. Similarly, we asked consumers, which countries do you want to buy products from? And what you're seeing on here is an index that is the differential between those 2. So anything, if you look up here, I don't know if there's a laser, the farther away you are, the greater the opportunity is relative to consumers are demanding it, but a lot of UK retailers are deprioritizing those markets. Another caveat here, it doesn't really take into account anything related to purchasing power, challenges of how to enter that market, and it could be in some of the markets that UK retailers are deprioritizing, they're already in there. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, but in essence, we wanted to identify our UK retailers targeting those markets where there's the highest demand for our products. And that's sort of some of the analysis that we saw. And the conclusion, based on just this data, granted there are some other factors that need to come in play, is that we're missing out on certain markets. In particular in the UK is Mexico, Australia, and India. There's some other markets in here as well, and Germany. By the way, anyone who's interested in getting this presentation later on, happy to send it to you, but just wanted to cover off some key highlights on this one here. And this is some of the things presented up here explains a little bit of why UK retailers are staying away from certain markets. So on the left-hand side, we asked, what markets are the most challenging for all retailers across the 1,200 across all markets? And then on the right-hand side are the results from UK retailers themselves. And if you compare the left hand with the right hand, you'll see that at the top 2, there's a consistency between all retailers worldwide and with the UK retailers. China and US is at the top. But then when you look a little bit further down, what we're seeing is, we mentioned India being one of those top markets that there's a lot of demand for UK retailers, but it's being deprioritized. Well, one of the key reasons, it's a little bit more challenging. Similarly, Australia is considered more challenging. Could be because of the distance, could be a shipping cost, or what have you. And if you look at the bottom there, it's France and Germany, the least, some of the least, challenging for retailers. Hence why you're seeing a lot of the near-border markets going in there. So it explains a little bit that when retailers in the UK are looking to go cross-border, they're picking the near-border because it's very easy, etc. Sorry, I'm just seeing the watch here. I need to move on. And some of the barriers they're seeing for not going to those markets is around generating demand. That's the top one. And the ones below that is more around the shipping cost and logistics area, and then after that with marketplace storefront. In some of Mexico, Mercado Libre is a big marketplace, and some other Asian countries, and in India it's Flipkart, Myntra, and so forth, and China, you all know about that as well. But it's predominantly around generating demand, but also on the logistics side, things that are easy actually to do for near-border marketplaces. Similarly, if we look at on the consumer side, some of the things they're finding difficult to buy from foreign cross-border suppliers, it overlaps what we saw from retailers. It's mainly around shipping costs were too high and delivery times too long. In particular, you'll see there Hong Kong and China. The other thing to note on the farther away cross-border is, for those of you who are not familiar, but if you look at Asia, marketplaces, if you're not in marketplaces, you're not going to do it very successfully. It's similar actually in Latin America as well, and we talked about Mexico and Brazil, Mercado Libre down there, but to be successful in Asia with cross-border, you have to be in those marketplaces. It doesn't mean you don't have your own direct site selling to them. As a matter of fact, it's important that you do, because what happens, there's an issue of trust, that you are the real brand. We've all heard about some fake products being sold in some marketplaces. Secondly, when you are selling through marketplaces, you're often limited to the catalog you can sell in terms of SKUs. What that does, though, is when people find out about you for generating brand awareness, they don't find a particular product, they will shift over to your direct side. And what we've seen when we've introduced clients both into marketplaces and direct side is that actually both sales went up at the same time. But for fast-growing markets in Asia, you have to be in marketplaces. Just one last interesting that has nothing to do with any of those three, but I thought it'd be interesting to show it up here, is where we're seeing cross-border become really important. It's usually sponsored and managed by key senior people at C-level or VP level within the organization. And we see a little bit over-indexing in other areas. So key takeaways, capitalize on, for the third lever is capitalize on brand awareness, but do localize this channel. There is a brand premium on Western brands in fast-growing emerging markets, those that are farther away, but you do need to localize a little bit of that. Sell where the consumers are shopping. In particular, you have to be in marketplaces. It's not an option not to. You might have some success, but it's not going to be major relative to your other business. And lastly, the delivery still matter. Global delivery doesn't mean you just send it over to the port in Shanghai. You actually have to get it all the way through to the last mile. And the quality could be very varied depending on which carrier you use, etc. And that's all I had, almost.
Yeah, sorry to cut you there. Thank you very much, George.